The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of shame. Alara knew its flavor intimately. A grit of pulverized rock and shattered pride that coated her tongue, clung to the back of her throat, and settled deep in her lungs like a terminal cough. It was the same dust that rose in a halo around the boots of her husband, Gideon, as he stood on the saloon porch, his voice a hammer striking the anvil of public opinion. He was a man who knew how to build a cage with words, and for 10 years she had lived inside it. Now he was dismantling it, plank by rotten plank, leaving her exposed to the merciless glare of the afternoon sun. "Barren," he declared, the word a stone cast into the silent crowd. It struck her first, a physical blow that stole the air from her chest. Then it rippled outwards, a shockwave of whispers and sharp, indrawn breaths. The faces stared, a sea of them, the blacksmith's wife, her lips a thin, cruel line. The preacher, his eyes downcast, offering no salvation. The children, their innocent curiosity, a special kind of cruelty. They were all there, witnesses to her unmaking. "I have given this woman my name, my home, my protection. I have tilled my fields and raised my herds, praying for a son to carry on my legacy. But the Lord, in his wisdom, has seen fit to curse me with a barren wife." Each word was a lie wrapped in the pious cloth of Scripture. His protection had been a fist, his home a cell. His prayers, drunken curses spat into the night. But here, in the court of the town square, his version was the only one that mattered. He was Gideon Cole, a man of property and standing. She was just Alara, a woman who had failed in her one sacred duty. He let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating, before delivering the final killing blow. "I can no longer suffer this divine punishment. I cast her out. She is no longer my wife. She is no longer under my roof. She is nothing to me." He turned then, not even gracing her with a final glance, and disappeared into the swinging doors of the saloon, the sound a definitive, echoing crack of finality. He had paid for his drink with her dignity. The crowd did not disperse. They watched, vultures circling a dying animal, waiting to see what it would do. Alara stood frozen, her worn calico dress a testament to a decade of thankless labor, her hands, chapped and raw from lye soap and hard work, clenched at her sides. Where could she go? What could she do? The small trunk at her feet, containing a spare dress, her mother's locket, and a worn-out Bible, was the sum of her existence. He had even kept the quilt she had pieced together from scraps, the one that had warmed him through fever and winter chill. A hot, stinging tear finally broke free, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of rage, not sorrow. Sorrow was a luxury she had wrung out of herself years ago. All that was left was a hollow, aching fury. She met the gaze of the blacksmith's wife and saw not pity, but a smug satisfaction. "I knew it," the woman's eyes said. "I always knew she was worthless." Alara's chin lifted. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was an act of war. She would not crumble here, in this circle of judgment. She would not give them the satisfaction. She bent, her back screaming in protest, and wrapped her fingers around the worn leather handle of her trunk. As she straightened, a shadow fell over her. It was long and stark in the afternoon light, stretching from the edge of the crowd. It belonged to a man who had stood apart from the rest, leaning against the far post of the general store's porch, his presence as silent and unmovable as the granite hills that ringed the valley. She hadn't noticed him before, but she felt his gaze now, different from the others. It was not curious, not cruel, not pitying. It was heavy, weighed down by something she recognized in the deepest, most broken part of herself. He pushed off the post and began to walk toward her. The crowd stirred, murmuring like wind through dry leaves. He was a man they knew, but did not know well, Silas Blackwood, the rancher from the high country, the one who had lost his wife and child to Code 2. The fever 3 winters passed. He seldom came to town, and when he did, he moved like a ghost, his face a mask of stoic grief, his eyes holding the vast, lonely emptiness of the sky. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence blocking out the sun, casting her completely. In his shade, he was tall, broader than Gideon, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape he inhabited. There were lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, a grin set to his mouth. He looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time that day, she felt seen not as a failure or an object of scorn, but as a person. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice unused to speaking. He left you with nothing? It was not a question of pity. It was a statement of fact, a shared understanding of loss. Alara could only manage a nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. Silas's gaze swept over the watching faces, a flicker of contempt in their depths. Then his eyes returned to hers. He looked at the pathetic trunk at her feet, at her trembling hands, at the defiant tilt of her chin. He saw the fire smoldering beneath the ashes of her humiliation. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. The town held its breath. What was the grieving widower doing? What could he possibly want with Gideon Cole's Barren cast-off? Silas made a decision. It was there in the subtle shift of his shoulders, the firming of his jaw. He took a step closer, his dusty boot almost touching the hem of her dress. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer platitudes. He offered a single, earth-shattering pronouncement, delivered in that same low, gravelly voice, yet it carried across the square like a thunderclap. "She is not nothing," he said, his eyes locked on hers, a strange, fierce light kindling in their depths. He said it to her, but it was a challenge to every soul watching. Then, without breaking his gaze, he reached down, his large, calloused hand engulfing the handle of her trunk. He lifted it, as if it weighed nothing. He looked at her, waiting. It was not a command, but a question. An invitation. "Are you coming?" For a moment, Alara could not move. Hope was a dangerous foreign country she had not visited in a decade. But the alternative was to remain here, to be devoured by the whispers and the scorn until she truly became the nothing Gideon had declared her to be. She took a breath, the dusty air filling her with a sudden, reckless strength. She took a step, and then another. She walked past the stunned faces of her tormentors, her gaze fixed on the broad, steady back of the man carrying her entire world. In one hand, as they reached his wagon, a plain, sturdy buckboard hitched to a single stoic mule, he swung the trunk up onto the bed. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "He called you Barren," Silas stated, his voice flat, devoid of judgment. Alara flinched, the word still a fresh wound. She braced herself for the inevitable question, the doubt, but it never came. Instead, Silas Blackwood looked directly into her eyes, and with a finality that echoed the closing of one life and the violent, uncertain birth of another, he said, he was wrong. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, not with possession, but with a strange, solemn recognition. "I call you mine." The journey to his ranch was a silent one, a passage from one world to another. The chattering, claustrophobic confines of Redemption Gulch fell away, replaced by the vast, indifferent beauty of the high country. The road narrowed, winding upwards through stands of ponderosa pine and groves of trembling aspen whose leaves shimmered like 1,000 silver coins. In the fading light, the air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of pine sap and damp earth, washing the stench of shame from her skin. Silas did not speak. He handled the reins with an economy of motion, his focus on the trail ahead. Alara sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stole glances at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the landscape. He was a man made of silence, and she, who had been silenced for so long, found it both unnerving and strangely comforting. There were no demands in his silence, no expectations. It was just space, room to breathe. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting the valley in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, they arrived. The ranch was nestled in a small, secluded valley, a pocket of meadowland carved out of the wilderness. A simple log cabin stood at its heart, smoke curling from its stone chimney in a thin, lonely ribbon. A sturdy barn, a corral, and a few smaller outbuildings were scattered nearby. It was a place of profound solitude and profound neglect. The fences were sagging in places, the wood weathered and gray. The meadow was overgrown, wildflowers warring with weeds. The cabin itself, though solidly built, had an air of abandonment, as if the life had been sucked out of it. It was a reflection of the man who lived there, strong, resilient, but hollowed out by grief. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. He came around and offered her a hand. His palm was rough, calloused, but his grip was surprisingly gentle as he helped her to the ground. For a fleeting moment, her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt, like a spark from a flint, passed between them. It was not passion. It was the simple, shocking recognition of another human's touch after a decade of blows and cold indifference. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He seemed not to notice, or chose not to. He retrieved her trunk and carried it to the cabin porch. "The well is over there," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Pump is good. Outhouse is behind the barn." He spoke of practicalities, of survival. It was the only language he had left. He pushed the cabin door open and stood aside for her to enter. The interior was dark, smelling of wood smoke, dust, and something else. Stale, lingering scent of sorrow. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A cast-iron stove, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few chipped plates and tin cups made up the kitchen. In the far corner was a bed, a simple frame with a lumpy mattress, covered by a single dark wool blanket. This was his space, his sanctuary of grief, and she was an intruder. "You can have the bed," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "I'll take the floor by the fire." It was an act of generosity so profound it left her speechless. In her old life, she had been the one to sleep on the floor when Gideon came home in one of his rages. "No," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. I can't take your bed." He looked at her, a flicker of something impatience, frustration, in his eyes. "There's no argument to be had, woman. You take the bed." He set her trunk down at its foot. "I'll see to the mule." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the heavy silence of his home, her home now too. The thought was terrifying. She ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, a fine layer of dust coming away on her fingers. She looked at the cold, empty fireplace, the single lonely chair. This was not a home, it was a waiting room. A place where a man was waiting to die. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. What had she done? She had traded a cage she knew for a wilderness she did not. She had fled the judgment of the town only to find herself in a tomb of another's making. She sank onto one of the chairs, the weight of her new, uncertain life pressing down on her. She was tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired. But then, her gaze fell upon the broom propped in a corner, its bristles worn and splayed. And a spark ignited in the hollow place inside her. She had been called barren, useless, nothing. But she was not nothing. She was a woman who knew how to work. She was a woman who knew how to build a life from scraps. She had done it for Gideon, and he had torn it all down. But here there was nothing to tear down. There was only emptiness, and emptiness could be filled. She stood up, her spine straightening. She walked to the door and looked out. The first stars were beginning to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The air was crisp and cold. She could hear Silas in the barn, his movements sure and steady. He had offered her a refuge. He had given her his bed. He had called her his. She did not know what that meant, not yet. But she knew what she could give him in return. She went back inside, picked up the broom, and began to sweep. The first days were a silent, awkward dance of two strangers bound by a desperate act. They moved around each other in the small cabin, their lives overlapping but never truly touching. The space was thick with unspoken things, his grief, her shame, their mutual uncertainty. Words were a currency they could not afford, so they spoke in the language of labor. Alara rose before dawn each morning, the habit of a decade ingrained in her bones. While Silas was out tending to his small herd of cattle, she attacked the cabin with a ferocity born of desperation. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, beat the dust from the single rug until her arms ached, washed the grime from the window panes, letting the morning light spill into the dark corners for what felt like the first time in years. She found a stash of his late wife's things packed away in a cedar chest linens, neatly folded, smelling of lavender and loss. She hesitated for a long moment, feeling like a grave robber. But the cabin needed life, and these were the only remnants of it. With a silent prayer for forgiveness, she took them out, aired them in the sun, and made the bed with clean, crisp sheets. She hung the simple, faded curtains in the window. When Silas returned for the midday meal, he would stop in the doorway, his eyes taking in the changes. He never said a word, but she saw the flicker of surprise, the subtle softening of his jaw. He would eat the food she prepared, simple meals of beans, cornbread, and the salted pork from his stores, his gaze fixed on his plate. The silence at the table was a chasm between them. She wanted to ask about his wife, about the child, about the sorrow that clung to him like a shroud, but the questions died on her lips. His grief was a locked room, and she did not have the key. He, in turn, began to repair the world outside the cabin. He mended the broken fences, his hammer blows echoing through the valley in a steady, rhythmic beat. He cleared a patch of land near the cabin for a garden, turning over the rich, dark soil with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. He showed her with gestures and a few clipped words how to set snares for rabbits, how to find the wild onions and herbs that grew by the creek. One afternoon, he found her struggling to draw water from the well, the pump handle stiff and resistant. He came over, wordlessly took the handle from her, and with a single powerful motion, brought a gush of clear, cold water splashing into the bucket. He looked at her hands, red and chapped from her work. "There's tallow in the barn," he sohed, his voice rough, "for your hands." It was the closest he had come to an act of tenderness, and it undid her. That night, as she lay in his bed, the scent of lavender and his own faint, masculine scent of pine and sweat rising from the pillow, she allowed herself to cry. Not for Gideon, not for the life she had lost, but for the small, unexpected kindness of a broken man. The town did not forget them. When their supplies ran low, the trip to Redemption Gulch was an ordeal. As they walked down the main street, a hush would fall. Doors would close. Whispers would follow them like biting flies. There they are, the widower and the barren woman, playing house up on that lonely mountain. It's unnatural. A disgrace to his dead wife's memory. Alara kept her head held high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the stares burning into her back. Silas seemed oblivious, his face a granite mask, but she saw the way his hands clenched into fists, the tightening of the muscles in his jaw. He was protecting her, absorbing the town's venom so it would not touch her. One day, at the general store, the blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Gable, cornered Alara by the bolts of fabric. "I suppose you think you've landed on your feet," she said, her voice dripping with malice. But don't think you've fooled anyone. We all know what you are. A curse, you'll bring that man nothing but ruin, just like you did Gideon. Before Alara could respond, a quiet voice cut in. That's enough, Martha. It was the preacher's wife, a small gentlewoman named Sarah, who had always shown Alara a quiet kindness. She stood beside Alara, her presence a small but solid shield. She's living in sin with that man, Mrs. Gable hissed. She's living, Sarah replied, her voice firm. And from what I hear, that ranch is starting to look like a home again for the first time in 3 years. Perhaps you should worry less about the perceived sins of others and more about the venom on your own tongue. Mrs. Gable sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red, and stormed away. Sarah turned to Alara, her eyes full of a soft, sad wisdom. Pay them no mind, dear. Their hearts are as barren as the land they accuse you of being. She pressed a small paper bag into Alara's hand. Some seeds for your garden, from my own. They always grow strong. The small act of solidarity was a balm to Alara's wounded spirit. It was a reminder that not all souls were as twisted and cruel as the ones who shouted the loudest. That night, as she and Silas sat at the table, the silence felt different, less like a chasm and more like a quiet, shared space. She looked at him, at the way the firelight played over the harsh planes of his face. The preacher's wife gave me some seeds today, she said, her voice soft. He looked up from his plate, his stormy eyes meeting hers. She's a good woman. She stood up for me. For us, a long moment passed. He pushed his empty plate away. People fear what they don't understand. What are we, Silas? The question slipped out, raw and vulnerable. For them to understand? He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He stared into the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, back in a time of laughter and warmth. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed grief. I had a wife, he began, the words sounding rusty, unused. Her name was Mary. She had hair the color of honey and a laugh that could make the wildflowers grow. And we had a son, Caleb. He had his mother's laugh. He paused, swallowing hard. Ilura's heart ached for him. She didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid to break the fragile spell. The fever took them both in the space of a week, he said, his voice flat, deadened by memory. I buried them myself, up on the ridge, overlooking the valley. After that, this place, it wasn't a home anymore. It was just a place to wait. I was waiting to join them. He finally turned his gaze from the fire to her. His eyes were raw, stripped of their usual defenses. She saw the full, crushing weight of his loss. And then I saw you, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Standing there in that square, with all of them staring. They called you nothing, and I looked at you, and I saw you refusing to break. I saw a fire in you they couldn't put out, and I thought maybe 2 broken things could make a whole. Maybe there was a reason to stop waiting. The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any touch. It was the key to the locked room of his grief, offered to her not as a burden, but as a gift. She reached across the table, her hand trembling, and laid it over his. His skin was rough but warm. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was strong, anchoring. I was waiting too, she whispered, the truth of it hitting her with the force of a physical blow. I just didn't know what for. In that moment, under the quiet watch of the crackling fire, the silence between them was finally filled. Not with words, but with a shared, fragile understanding. They were not a widower and a barren woman. They were Silas and Alara, and they were finally starting to build a home. The seasons turned, painting the high country in broad, sweeping strokes. The vibrant green of summer deepened into the gold and crimson of autumn. The garden Ilara had planted with Sarah's seeds yielded a small but precious harvest. The cabin, once a hollow shell of grief, was now filled with the smells of baking bread, drying herbs, and wood smoke. Laughter, a sound that had been absent for years, began to echo within its walls, quiet at first, then more frequent, more free. They worked together, a seamless rhythm developing between them. He taught her to ride, his large hands steady on her waist as he lifted her onto the saddle of a gentle mar. She taught him how to mend his clothes, her nimble fingers making neat, almost invisible stitches. They fell into a routine that was both comforting and life-affirming. They were no longer two separate, broken souls, coexisting in the same space. They were a partnership, a unit, a family of two. The intimacy between them grew not in grand pronouncements, but in small, quiet moments. The way he would leave a wildflower on her pillow. The way she would save him the last piece of pie. The way their hands would brush as they passed in the narrow space by the hearth, a current of warmth passing between them. One evening, as a cold autumn wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. Ilara was reading from her mother's Bible, her voice soft in the quiet room. Silas was carving a piece of wood, the shavings falling at his feet. He was carving a small, delicate bird. He stopped, holding it up to the light. "Mary loved the bluebirds," he said, his voice soft, the memory no longer a source of sharp, stabbing pain, but a gentle, melancholic ache. She said they carried the color of the sky on their wings. Ilara closed the Bible. "It's beautiful, Silas." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the flickering firelight. "This place. It feels like a home again, Ilara. You did that. You brought the life back. We did it," she corrected gently. "Together." He set the carving down and moved to sit on the hearth beside her. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The simple touch sent a shiver through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "When I lost them," he said, his voice low, "I thought my heart had been carved out, that there was nothing left inside but an empty space. But you found a way to plant a garden in it." He leaned in, his gaze intense, and for the first time, she saw not just gratitude or companionship in his eyes, but something deeper. Something that mirrored the feeling that had been growing in her own heart, a tender, tenacious vine wrapping itself around the broken pieces of her soul. He kissed her then. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, of shared silences and second chances. It was the sealing of a pact made that first day in the dust of the town square, a promise to heal. But the world outside their secluded valley had not forgotten them, and it was not content to let them heal in peace. The first snow of winter had just begun to dust the high peaks when he returned. Gideon. He rode into their valley not on the tired nag he'd left town on, but on a fine, strong horse, a silver-badged sheriff at his side. Ilara was outside, splitting kindling when she saw them. The sight of her ex-husband, his face bloated with a smug, proprietary arrogance, sent a spear of ice through her heart. She dropped the axe, her breath catching in her throat. Silas came out of the barn, a pitchfork in his hand. He saw the riders, and his body went rigid. He moved to stand in front of Ilara, a human shield between her and the past that had come. "To reclaim her, Cole," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "You're not welcome here." Gideon swung down from his horse, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "That's where you're wrong, Blackwood. According to the law, half of what you have is mine." "What foolishness are you talking?" Silas demanded, his knuckles white on the handle of the pitchfork. The sheriff, a portly man with a self-important air, cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole has filed a claim. He states that upon his dissolution of marriage with this woman," he gestured dismissively at Ilara, "he was not properly compensated for the dowry he paid her family 10 years ago." a dowry of livestock and seed. He claims that since she brought nothing to your arrangement, her share of this property is by rights his. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. Elura's family had been poor farmers. There had been no dowry, only her willingness to work herself to the bone for him. There was no dowry, Elura said, her voice shaking but clear. He's lying. Gideon laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the crisp mountain air. A barren woman's word against mine? Who do you think they'll believe, my dear? I am a man of standing. You are used goods, taken in by a lonely fool. Get off my land, Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a step forward. The sheriff put a hand on his pistol. Now, hold on, Blackwood. This is a legal matter. It'll be settled by Judge Miller in town, day after tomorrow. Until then, you're not to lay a hand on Mr. Cole. He has a right to be here, to inspect his potential property. The finality in the sheriff's voice was a death knell. They were trapped. Gideon was going to use the law, a tool of the very society that had condemned her, to destroy the one good thing she had ever had. He wasn't just after the land, he was after her soul. He wanted to prove that she was, and always would be, nothing. The next 2 days were a living hell. Gideon swaggered around the ranch as if he owned it, his presence a poison seeping into the soil. He ran his hands over the sturdy fences Silas had built, appraised the cattle with a greedy glint in his eye, and walked through the cabin, touching the things Elura had cleaned and mended, tainting them with his presence. He made lewd comments to her, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Silas was a coiled spring of fury. He watched Gideon's every move, his body radiating a murderous rage that was almost palpable. Elura feared he would snap, that he would kill Gideon and be hanged for it, and their fragile world would be shattered forever. "Don't," she whispered to him one night, as they lay side by side in the bed, the wall of his back a rigid barrier between them. "Don't let him provoke you. That's what he wants." "He has no right," Silas growled into the darkness. "This is our home, our home." The words were a lifeline in a sea of despair. "Then we will fight for it," she said, her voice gaining strength, "not with our fists, but with the truth." The day of the hearing, they rode into town together. The sky was the color of lead, threatening more snow. The town square was crowded, a repeat of the day she had been cast out, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was still the morbid curiosity, the hunger for drama. But there was something else too, a flicker of doubt, a whisper of support. The story of their quiet, hard-working life in the mountains had trickled down, carried by the wind, by the few hunters who had passed their way, by the preacher's wife. The hearing was held in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. Judge Miller, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, sat at a makeshift bench. Gideon stood before him, smug and confident, flanked by the sheriff. Elura and Silas stood on the other side, alone. Gideon told his story, a masterful performance of a wronged husband, his voice dripping with false piety and righteous indignation. He produced a forged document, a crude list of livestock and goods that he claimed was a copy of the dowry agreement. The crowd murmured. It looked bad. Elura's heart sank. It was her word against his, and her word was worth nothing. Then, Judge Miller turned to her. Ma'am, he corrected himself. What is your response to this claim?" Elura took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. She saw Mrs. Gable, a triumphant smirk on her face. She saw the preacher, his head bowed. And then she saw Sarah, the preacher's wife, standing in the back, her face a beacon of quiet encouragement. She looked at Silas, standing tall and solid beside her, his eyes telling her, "I am with you." She found her voice. "My name is Elura," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent room. "And I am not this man's wife. I was, but he cast me out. He declared me nothing in front of all of you. There was no dowry. My family had nothing to give but my 2 hands, and I gave them to him for 10 years. I cooked and cleaned and mended, and worked his fields until my hands bled. That was my dowry. A decade of my life." She turned to Gideon, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "You call me barren. It is true, I never gave you a child. But you, Gideon Cole, are the truly barren one. Your heart is a wasteland. Your soul is a desert. You can build nothing, create nothing. You can only seek to destroy what others have built." A gasp went through the crowd. No one had ever spoken to Gideon Cole like that. She turned back to the judge. "This man," she said, gesturing to Silas, "took me in when I had nothing. He gave me shelter. He gave me respect. He did not ask for a dowry. He asked for nothing. Together, we took a place that was dying of grief, and we brought it back to life. We built a home. Not with livestock or seed, but with our own 2 hands. With our sweat, and with our hearts. That is a kind of wealth you cannot measure, Judge. And it is a wealth he," she pointed a trembling finger at Gideon, "has no right to." The room was utterly silent. Judge Miller looked from Alara's passionate, tear-streaked face to Gideon's, which had turned a mottled, furious red. "Do you have any proof of this dowry, Mr. Cole?" the judge asked, his voice sharp. "Other than this piece of paper? My word is my proof." Gideon blustered. "And I have the word of this woman," the judge said, his gaze lingering on Alara with a newfound respect. "A woman who has, by all accounts, turned a desolate ranch into a thriving homestead. A woman who speaks with the conviction of truth." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Does anyone here have anything to add to this matter?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a voice from the back of the room. "I do." It was Sarah, the preacher's wife. She walked forward, her small frame radiating a quiet authority. "I have known Alara for 10 years, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I knew her family. They were good, hard-working people, but they were poor. They had no livestock to give as a dowry. I also know Gideon Cole, and I know that his piety is a cloak he wears to hide a cruel and greedy heart." Mrs. Gable let out an indignant squawk, but Sarah ignored her. "And I have seen what has become of the Blackwood Ranch," she continued. "I gave Alara seeds from my own garden. Seeds do not grow in barren ground, Judge. They grow where there is care and diligence and life. That ranch is alive again. Because she is there, because they are there together. To take that from them would not be justice. It would be a crime." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The tide of public opinion, so long against her, was turning. Judge Miller banged his gavel. "This court is not in the business of rewarding bullies and liars. Mr. Cole, your claim is dismissed. The Blackwood Ranch belongs to Mr. Blackwood, and to whomever he chooses to share it with." He looked directly at Silas and Alara. "Get out of my sight, Cole, and if I hear you've troubled these good people again, I'll have you run out of this territory on a rail." Gideon stood there, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The crowd parted before him as he stormed out of the saloon, his own shame now a taste of dust in his mouth. A collective breath was released. It was over. They had won. Alara felt her knees go weak. Silas's arm went around her, holding her steady. She leaned against him, burying her face in his chest, and sobbed. Not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, his own body trembling slightly. The people of the town, the same people who had watched her humiliation, now came forward. They offered quiet congratulations, words of respect. The blacksmith, Mr. Gable, a man who had always followed his wife's lead, came up to Silas and clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got a good woman there, Blackwood," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "A real fighter." They had not just won a legal battle. They had won their dignity. They had won their place. They rode home not in silence, but in a quiet state of wonder. The threatened snow began to fall, large, soft flakes that blanketed the world in a pristine, peaceful white. It was a cleansing, a new beginning. When they reached their valley, it was a winter wonderland, the pines heavy with snow, the cabin warm and welcoming, a beacon of golden light in the twilight. They stood on the porch for a long moment, just looking at it. Their home. Fought for, won. Silas turned to her, his face serious in the soft falling snow. "The judge. He said the ranch belongs to me and whoever I choose to share it with." He took both of her hands in his. "Ilara, I choose you. Not just to share my land or my home, but my life, all of it." He didn't have a ring. He didn't have flowery words. He had only his heart, whole and healed, to offer her. "Marry. Emi Ilara," he whispered, his breath misting in the cold air. "Be my wife, in name and in truth, forever." Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cold cheeks. But they were tears of joy, a joy so profound it felt as if her heart would burst. "Yes," she breathed. "Oh, Silas, yes." He pulled her into his arms, and under the silent falling snow, in the heart of their own private sanctuary, he kissed her. It was a kiss of promises kept, of battles won, of a love that had grown in the most broken of ground. They were not married by a preacher or witnessed by a crowd. They were married by the mountains and the sky and the silent, falling snow. Their vows were the shared beats of their hearts, their rings the callous strength of their intertwined hands. That night, as the snowstorm raged outside, their little cabin was an island of warmth and light. The fire crackled in the hearth. The small wooden bluebird sat on the mantelpiece. And the bed, their bed, was no longer a place of lonely grief or uncertain refuge, but a haven of love. They had both been called broken. They had been called barren and cursed and lost. But as they lay in each other's arms, wrapped in the warmth of the quilt she had finally reclaimed from her memories, they knew the truth. Scars were not signs of weakness, but proof of survival. Emptiness was not an end, but a space waiting to be filled. And family was not a thing of blood, but a thing of choice, a stubborn, defiant, beautiful choice to take another's broken pieces and declare, with every fiber of your being, "You are mine."